I apologize, in presenting mode, it's a little hard to see. Do you know if my coworker has joined? Doesn't look like he has. Basically, my coworker was just our loan officer in the Chesapeake and Virginia Beach office. Hopefully he can join in a little bit, but I guess he's the most local loan officer to your respective offices. Um, However, I've been working at Colonial Farm Credit for around 5 years, and I cover more of our slightly Western territory, have your Dinwiddie, Prince George, Sussex, Surrey, that sort of thing. So anyways, just to kind of start off the presentation, Colonial Farm Credit is a organization that's lender only. So we're not a bank or anything. All we do is lending. Colonial Farm Credit itself has over $600 million in loans, and we cater to over 600,000 customers. These figures are a little bit old. We have roughly 82 employees, and we cover 45 counties in Eastern Virginia. However, there is a farm credit for every county of America. So it's not only Eastern Virginia that has a farm credit, it's just this specific farm credit. So I just kind of want to go over our products just a little bit. So our main sort of bread and butter is land loans. So we can do 80% financing on land. We have no acreage minimum or maximum. We can go up to 20 years. It's a fixed rate for the life of the loan. We do also have balloon rate products. However, most people buying land do want the fixed rate. We have no prepayment penalties. So anytime anyone wants to pay it off, that's perfectly fine. And then we can structure it on a monthly, quarterly, or semi-annual, or annual payments to match whatever cash flow works for the customer. And then we are cooperative at Farm Credit. So all our loans receive what we call patronage, which basically we give a dividend back at the end of the year to every customer. We also have home loans. This isn't as special as a lot of other lenders have it. Really, the big thing is there's any acreage. So no restriction on acreage. The only thing is the home has to be worth more than the land. Construction loans. One of our main things is borrower managed construction loans. So the clients do not have to have a contractor. However, it is only limited to 80% loan to value. At that point, it is a construction to perm loan. So one closing, and we would need all the documents just as a contractor would give us. We also have contractor managed, which is 95% loan to value. And again, any acreage, however, the house has to be worth more than the land. So when me and Chrissy were talking, we kind of talked about types of land and what would be, informative. So really for farm credit, we break down the types of land into open land, woodland, cutover, and swampland. So woodland is probably the one with the biggest difference. So we look at the age, whether it's 10-year-old pine versus 30-year-old pine, or whether it's hardwood, the type, like I said, hardwoods or pine or mixed and managed, that makes a huge difference whether it was planted and has been managed or whether they just let it reseed on itself and grow. Let's see. And then I kind of got into the prices of land. So price of land is kind of hard for me as a lender to really talk about because I'm not a appraiser, but just kind of a general rule of thumb, open land is worth more than woodland, and woodland's worth more than swampland. And the older the woodland is, the more it's worth. Ponds, even though they're great to look at, and to us personally, they carry value. As far as valuing property, to the lender and to the comps around it, they don't carry as much value as a lot of people want to place on them. I know, in the discussion before this meeting, we got to talk about what us as lenders are looking at and maybe some things that you guys as realtors aren't aware of. And ponds are really a big one because, you may think, oh, well, it took them $50,000 to build, but that won't be covered in a one-to-one basis. The other thing, kind of obvious, but prices, differ in every county. So the price of cropland in Virginia Beach is very different than the price of cropland in Sussex County. It can be double. So it's very different. And then if you follow anything out west, the price of cropland in Iowa has gone up to 10,000+ an acre. The smaller properties, the price per acre increases, and it lowers for larger properties. So your price per acre isn't going to be the same for a 500-acre property versus a 20-acre property. And then all our appraisals are comp based. So really the market is what is deciding, the values. So just some miscellaneous items. I know we talked about, what a lender is looking for. So we have no new survey requirement as long as there's an existing survey or the meets and bounds is listed correctly. The time frame we usually like to see in a contract is 30 to 60 days. If the buyer is wanting a survey for their purchase, much longer, because surveys can take, up to 3 months, depending on the size and density of the county and location. We generally like to see the tax map on the contracts, because just listing an address is a little difficult, especially if it's raw land or it's several parcels, connected. So the tax maps really, really help us out. The other thing is Colonial Farm Credit has a population density requirement. So basically we can't lend in certain locations because of the population density in those locations, which is another reason. I don't know if he has joined, but my coworker knows a little bit more about those things in Virginia Beach and Chesapeake. And then a big one, especially in 2022 and 2023, I feel is ingress and egress point has to match with both the legal and the physical access. So both legal access on the survey has to match the physical access in real life. And the other thing is, if you cannot drive a car onto that property through the legal access, most lenders will not lend on that property. So even if there's legal access, but your physical access is through trees, it's not a lendable piece of property. Land in transition is another thing. So Colonial Farm Credit isn't really in the business of dealing with land in transition. Now, obviously things slip through the gap, but land in transition is really valued differently because there's already value kind of indirectly put into it because it's property being set aside for development. Conservation easements, I know you have some of those in Virginia Beach and Chesapeake. We can lend on them, however, it's 75% loan to value. And then the conservation easements and any restrictions on building, I would say affect land probably about 20% of its value, is diminished due to the nature of the restrictions. Unless it's, just a large stand of timber, then it may not affect it at all. But if it has any, if it's close to any, residential homes, any of the residential kind of inherent value might be taken away depending on those restrictions, and it's very case to case basis. But that was kind of, I know I ran through that really fast, and I can go back to any specific slide, but I really just wanted this to be more of a question and answer, just because I know land is very diverse and there's a lot of different kind of items about it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you go over land in transition and what we do land in transition?
Yeah, so land in transition, I guess it's tricky because it's not really well defined. So different counties have different, to my understanding, different ways they qualify what land in transition is. So land in transition is an actual designation that can be put on acreage. So if you have, 100 acres and it's not actually in a land in transition area that the county has set up, it's not technically land in transition, which is a weird thing to think of because realistically in 30 years, they may have sold off half of it to other people putting houses and things like that. So when I say land in transition, I'm really talking about the specific areas the county has said is land in transition. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, apologize. I hate to interrupt. So there's a piece of acreage for sale in Chesapeake over by the Chesapeake Regional Airport that is considered land in transition. It's on Shillelagh Road and it's considered land in transition. It's currently agricultural, but Chesapeake's plan is to run a 4-lane road through it. Like it's already written into the city plan. It is land in transition. It will become residential as soon as that road is in. Like it is transitioning into not rural anymore. They have plans for it.
Almost like city planning.
Yes.
City is deep in this.
Yes. City has deemed that they're taking
designated it is changing into something else, like from agriculture to commercial or something like that.
Yeah. So if it's land changing from agricultural to residential, that's something we can still probably lend on. It's generally something, we have to talk with the buyer about because generally we don't want to lend to someone who's just immediately going to split up the items into multiple parcels and sell them. However, if it's planned for transitioning to commercial, which is most of what the land in transition is it's kind of for commercial use, and that's something Colonial Farm Credit really isn't. It's not something we do. Now another lender, like a commercial lender, may have no problem doing it. However, we're really just interested in residential and agricultural land. I don't know if that answers your question or if I even covered your question at all. I apologize.
And that land in transition, what that transition was, but yeah, that basically covers it. So the city's plans for it, basically it's land in transition, and yeah. And then the other part, of course, of course, you guys don't want to lend to somebody who's going to subdivide everything because there's a lot more risk in that, and it's you on the property, not them. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, and to also add on to that, basically to make a long story short, the farm credit system, which is the system that kind of governs all the different farm credits all across America, was made by the Farm Credit Administration, which basically we have certain rules and regulations we have to follow. So even though we're not a governmental organization, we do have some things that prohibit us from competition between the banking system, if that makes sense. So that's another reason we have that population rule. So like, heart of Lynn Haven, we probably can't lend unless there's, a property over 10 acres. But the Hickory area is, pretty much fair game no matter the acreage. So just kind of the difference in where we can lend in Chesapeake and Virginia Beach. So like Pungo area, we can lend all day. There are different areas like that.
Can you speak to a little more about being able to get onto the property? What was the portion where you were talking about access to the property? Do you mean from a main road or not wooded, or what does that look like?
Yeah. So basically nowadays with land with the low inventory, what we've seen as lenders is a lot of people selling property without sufficient ingress and egress. So basically, there may be a legal easement allowing you to get on that property, but the physical access is 200 feet down from where the legal easement technically is, or the legal easement is going through trees and you can't actually drive onto that property through the easement because there's trees. Now, obviously, if you can access it from a main road, usually you're fine there, barring it's like a main highway with a giant ditch and, the county won't give you access to it. But for the most part, if you're coming from an actual road and your property abuts an actual road, there's no issue with ingress and egress. But where the issue is if you have properties which are mostly land off of another property behind or adjacent to that don't directly touch a road.
Okay, so out of curiosity, because I've seen this situation out in Tennessee, but of course it's Tennessee. So where there was basically farmland, original owner had passed away, goes into an estate split it into quarters and sold the big farm off in quarters. It was about 18 acres per quarter, and the back lots had a flagpole. So basically they had a little flagpole connecting to a driveway for the front property, and then the rest of it was like there was a fair amount of trees on there that did actually block. So they would have had to clear that away to actually finish the driveway onto the land. How is there like a certain percentage or amount they would have to clear that then disqualifies them, out of curiosity? Because like this one, like the rest of it, once they got on the lot, it was all farmland and that was fine. But there was probably about 20 to 30 feet deep of trees.
Yeah, so I usually tell people it just has to be cleared enough that you could drive, like a Honda Civic on the property. So you don't have to clear like 30 feet or 20 feet, you see most easements 20, 30, 50 feet. You could just clear, a good, I guess, 7-8 foot path, just enough for a car to fit in. And as far as, I don't know if you were talking about this at all, but it brings up a good point, discussions with the landowner. I've seen people set it up in a separate contract, or either they'll just raise the purchase price for the person to clear the land ahead of time. Obviously, your property still has to appraise, so that's a different discussion. But there's ways to work with the landowner to get that done.
Thank you.
So Christy, you brought up a really good point about flag lots. So in a lot of rural areas with density rules, some flag lots, depending on the use that somebody wants to use the land for, I've seen flag lots be absolutely useless because they don't have the required road frontage that county requires for
sidelines.
Yep. Sideline setback, and then have the road frontage. So like Suffolk, specifically Suffolk, they have an issue with flag lots. They don't want them. They want you to have 135 feet of road frontage to build a house. You can't get away with a flag lot.
Yeah, that's another issue that we didn't talk about. Every county has something different regarding, what they want. So I always, tell people when they're looking at buying land, to talk with their zoning or their planning department at whatever county.
Yeah, so that's one of those things that I would consider as due diligence prior to writing your contract. Because I know that in Chesapeake and Virginia Beach, I've seen some properties for sale lately that are, 50 plus acres, and they have continual use clauses running with the land. Okay, and that affects the value that you can have on the land because it's not going to be now used for its intended purpose. So there's one in particular that's on Blackwater Road. I think it's 53 acres, has a continuing use clause. City of Chesapeake wanted to keep its green spaces, about 20 years ago. And they were paying farmers a large amount to have a continual use clause for it to be farmland or recreational property only for 50+ years, depending on how much that farmer wanted to get from the city. And this one in particular, I believe, has 23 more years until it can actually be used as something, and neighborhoods butt up directly to it.
So that means you can't build.
You can't build a house on it. 23 years. I mean, because I had a client that was like, well, a golf course is recreational. I was like, no, it's not. Not that kind of recreation.
Grandma to buy the brand new baby.
Yeah.
It was just born, because at 23 years, they can then.
They're gonna have this.
Together.
Exactly. They're gonna have this great piece of property, you know, that they could develop if they wanted to after they get out of college.
Jesus, 23 years.
But like that is,
Where's our world gonna be in 23 years?
but that's
We're
one
gonna
of
be in 10 minutes.
so, but that's one of those things that I caution everybody, like do as much due diligence as you possibly can before you even write that land contract. Because you need to give yourself time. 30 days is not a lot of time to do due diligence on that large of a parcel.
Unless you have an end with the city.
Yeah, I mean, it is just not, it's just not enough time. There's a couple of clauses that I specifically like to write into my land contracts, which sound, you know.
And a title search would reveal this.
So that's the thing, is it will reveal it, but the title company has to be familiar with the land process, because not all title companies do land. They're not necessarily looking for it. I would hate for, you know, a title company to I mean, it's their insurance, don't get me wrong, but I would hate for them to miss that.
Well, your closing attorney.
Right, your closing
Initiate.
attorney should initiate, you know,
Title search.
Yeah.
Go to the city as a backup.
I would have 100% go to the city as a backup. 100% of the time.
Actually go to the city first.
That's what I do before I ever
Go to
read the
city
con.
First, find out everything. And
Right.
then have it.
Right, because there was another another property that was for sale down Blackwater way, almost in North Carolina. I think it was on West Gibbs Road, and it was this beautiful 30-acre piece of property, and it was for sale, and it had this crazy looking log cabin thing on it that was just rotted to all get out. And somebody wanted to subdivide it to purchase it, but it's zoned Ag 2. Which means that in the Ag 2 for Virginia Beach, their density rules are 1 per, and it wasn't quite 38, 1 per 15.
1 per 15.
So the size of this property, you could divide, you could give somebody 1 acre and the rest of it had to stay with the other one. You couldn't have 2 equal divided properties because there wasn't quite enough land to divide it equally. I think it was actually like 29 acres or something like that. It was some odd number, but that's one of those things that, you know, I would just caution your buyers when buying land, like it is a slow process. It is a very slow process, especially depending on what you want done with that land. If you have somebody purchasing to build, you need time for your perk tests, your septic design, if you need it. Like there are so many different things that need to be done. So the more time you give yourself, the better. And it's always a good idea, even though you have the legal description. I usually reference the city's GPIN or whatever they call it, their tax ID, in the contract as well, because that goes back to the original plat for that piece of property. Because a lot of things start to overlap, especially when you get into rural areas. Like, oh, that I gave that piece to, you know, Jim Bob, you know, 500 years ago. And then now your client has a piece of property that's not as big, but that's also why in the land contract, you have an approximation. And you always want to get, so in the beginning of the land contract, and I can't get out of full screen for whatever reason.
Is he still on with us?
Yes, he is. Did you have a question for him?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, he's still on with us. Exit full screen. There we go. So I have, what do I have? Oh, no. So I have one I can share with you guys. I think I think I can. I'm gonna do it. So I have one I can share with you guys if you can see this. And this is one of the land contracts that I had been written. And it was a piece of property that had, and I had to argue with the listing agent to get her to allow me to do 60 days. And it was during the middle of COVID. It was a property that had wetlands.
In your contract, you wrote 60 days due diligence.
I wrote 60 days and I had to argue to get those 60 days because
Yeah, but
our,
subject perk test
and a wetlands delineation. And during COVID, you know,
throughout the whole world had shut down.
I mean,
How
Army
many
Corps of
did not
Engineers,
engage?
Army Corps of Engineers was backed up by 8 months. 8 months.
What did you do, extend?
Wow.
No, so we didn't end up extending. We found, we did it through Bay Environmental because they work very closely with the Army Corps of Engineers a lot. They do a lot of their projects. So a lot of times Army Corps of Engineers, instead of going to the property
We'll
for
sub
that,
it to that.
they'll sub it to them anyways. And a lot of times they'll do a desk review for them versus actually going to the property. So anyways, so when you get down into the contract, I'm trying to find exactly what I want to show you guys. Because this contract got written 50 times. It was a wild one. It was a wild one. Okay, so right here under paragraph 3, if applicable, it's the purchase price is based on the property containing X amount of acres or X amount of square feet. And then upwards or downwards of any adjustment. So if you're buying large parcels of land and you think you're getting 100 acres, what margin of error is your client going to what margin of
Plus or
error?
minus 10 acres.
Right.
5
Are they
acres,
gonna be,
whatever they're comfortable.
what are they gonna be mad about?
So you wrote that. in-
So you write it in there. Now, this parcel was too small to bother with it. They were okay with it. Half of the parcel was in the water anyways.
Oh.
So it didn't matter to them. However, that is one of those things that you have to, you know, because if he was like, well, I gave it to this guy, I told him he could use it 40 years ago. And now this guy's got a claim on it because he's been using it for the last 40 years. Because what is it for Virginia Beach? Is it 15 years for adverse reception? I think it's 15.
Adverse, Fitzy.
Yeah, and most of the time you don't see a lot of adverse possession. Land is one of the few times you'll see it, especially out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because somebody put up a trailer and they've been living on the back 40 for, you know,
Right.
the last 60 years. So another thing I like to put in my land contracts is this other contingencies portion in here. So in my other contingencies, I like to put this purchase agreement is contingent upon buyer obtaining all required approvals necessary, including but not limited to construction and completion of new dwelling. Pool deck, whatever they want to put there. I need it to be completely contingent on all of those things and the discovery of all of those things. So I put myself in because I was arguing with this listing agent. They didn't understand why due diligence took so long. So I actually put myself in a 30-day extension so that I could extend out to 90 if I needed to. So it was just kind of, you know, one of those things where we were just trying to get along. But this contract actually ended up scrapped. And the seller's estate attorney wrote another attorney. My buyer was a real estate attorney who hired her own real estate attorney. So it was 3 attorneys like versus each other. Like, I mean, me and the poor listing
Find
agent
out
just
too.
sat there and watched it all happen.
All of the here to buys.
Oh my
Bobby,
goodness.
Chavo.
Right? Oh, it was terrible. And then of course the estate attorney is an estate attorney. He's not a real estate attorney. So he's not writing it like a real estate contract. And so I've got 2 real estate attorneys that are sending it back with red marks through it every 20 minutes until finally somebody just got frustrated and was like, this is fine. We'll just sign this. So it was a fun one.
Chrissy.
Yes.
All right, so your other contingencies, like There's a lot in there for like, construction completion of new decking, pool, pier, boat dock, all that. Is that, like, did you have your contractor, like, is the builder or the contractor, were they the ones? The approval for all that stuff, like basically just going to the city, getting, as long as they can get the permits?
No, so that is at the buyer's discretion, depending on what kind of loan they were getting. So Robert actually is the one that did the loan on this contract. It was back in 2020, but they chose to purchase the land with a land contract and then build later on. So the buyer is responsible for doing all of those things. So we had to have a septic, so we had to have a perk test done. Not only do you have to have a perk test done for a septic, you also have to have a perk test done to make sure that your house isn't going to sink. Percolation test, how fast can the water dissipate through the soil? The gentleman that we hired is Quinn Zimmerman. I can never remember where he works for some reason. I remember him now. But when he does the perk test, he does the septic design and files the permit, which is good for 2 years with the city that he is doing it in. I always recommend having it done. They had the Canada Surveying do the survey. Amy Conley from Bay Environmental did the wetlands delineation. They actually ended up having to purchase a variance for this one. And again, like next month, Amy Conley will be here doing going over the new restrictions for the Chesapeake Bay stuff, and she'll also be going over wetlands delineations with us. So they ended up having to get purchasing a variance because they were actually going to build into the landward setback, not the seaward setback. But one of the things you have to watch out for when it comes to septics, and this happens a lot in rural areas too, where you have these large plots, somebody will take an irrigation well and put it at the property line. But if your lot's not big enough, you now can't put a septic on it because there's a well too close to it.
Yeah, you had like 2 different people.
There's a lot.
There's so much. Hire professionals. Hire professionals.
Expensive.
It does get expensive.
Potentially
No,
not.
that's what I'm getting at. So was there like one person you can hire to manage all of that, or did you have
They-
to hire?
Hang on, talk slower, Jed.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So with that, I guess what I was getting at was there one person that you could hire to manage all of that, clearing all those like things for the buyer that they wanted? Or
Nope.
did you actually have to find each one of them?
So you got to find each one of them because most people that do septic. They don't do surveys, and you have to have the survey in order to have the septic design done. And you have to, because they have to draw it on the survey, and then you have to have the survey in order to do the wetlands delineation, because all of these maps have to overlap themselves into the septic design to be approved by the wetlands board, or be approved by the city, or be approved by the health department. Because it goes to multiple, like if we're talking about something that's on water, has to be approved by Army Corps of Engineers for the build, has to be approved by the local wetlands board, has to be, when you do a septic, it has to be approved by the health department for that county. And it has to be approved by zoning. Like you got like 5 or 6 different government bodies that you're having to get this approved through.
So my next question, if I needed that, do you have all those people? Contacts?
Yes, I have all those contacts.
Fantastic.
Yeah, they will all be coming in for weird shit in real estate as the year goes on. I have Quinn Zimmerman coming in. I have Amy Conley coming in. This is Robert Locke. He's my go-to when I have really just what seems like an easy question for me to answer, land questions, because the rules change all the time. In my additional terms, because as David stated, it can be really expensive for your buyer to find out that they cannot build a thing that they want. So in my additional terms, I put in that the seller agreed to purchase the wetlands delineation from the buyer at cost if deemed unsuitable for the buyer's intended use, or the seller is not willing to extend the closing date.
Oh, wow.
The seller agrees to clear lot of any and all trees allowable via wetlands to include stump grinding and additional undergrowth, because that was specific to that lot. But I wanted to be able to recoup some of their funds, because for that I think 1.92 acres, the wetlands delineation was, I believe it was $2,300. And the septic design, which includes the permit, it's the perk test, the septic design, and he files it with the city for you. It's good for 2 years, and you can get an extension on that. Was $1,200 plus the survey.
3,500 and a survey was what,
Mm.
1,000?
I think it was like $800.
Okay, so 4,500.
$4,500 to
It's
possibly,
on a 1 acre point something property.
yes,
It's 150 acres,
God help you.
315, 20,000.
It could be, well, it depends on what you want to do with it. So like, if you're trying to get something, Robert's not your guy if you're trying to do a development. Like, you want to go down and talk to Chris Lyle, like that's your guy for that. Like, he's with Virginia Commonwealth, that's all he does. But most of the time when they start doing these huge parcels like that, it does cost quite a bit, because a lot of times they're surveying from the air. So. Go ahead, Lily.
No.
Right, Robert, you said, you do construction loans?
I apologize. Can you say that again?
Yeah, you do construction loans as well, Robert?
We do both your conventional type construction, but the only kind of difference between most people is we have no land limits. So most lenders won't do construction on anything over 10 acres, or else they'll want to parcel out the front 10 acres. So we can do 95% construction to perm loan on that property, regardless of the size, as long as the home is worth more than the land. And then we can also do borrower managed construction, or just regular contractor construction if the land's worth more than the house. However, that's limited to 80% financing. But it is loan to value on the borrower managed side. So if they already own the land, they can use their land equity to help with the construction.
Nice. All right, so with construction loans, if I have somebody that wants to buy a piece of land to build on, what is, I guess not the, if we find the right one, what's the minimum amount of loan to value, like down payment, that they would need for the construction loan?
Yeah, so if they use a Class A contractor and go through the conventional side, it would be, if they have just bought the land and they basically have a loan on it, they would need 5% loan to value as a down payment. So whatever, to be simple about it, they would need 5% down, but realistically, most people won't do a land loan for less than 20% down. So then you would probably have at least one of those percents in equity. So most of the time, 4 to 5% if they're going through a contractor.
Did you say 45 or 4 or 5?
4 to 5. I'm sorry.
Okay. I was like, wait. So now, what if somebody bought a piece of land and on a regular, land loan, and then decided that they wanted to build on it?
Yeah, so
Later
we
on
would,
down the road.
we would just do the construction loan, and the land loan would be consumed by a construction loan, basically.
Oh, got it. So you could just basically, you get it, you'd be able to roll it in. That's
Structure the
interesting,
farm.
instead of doing a whole new thing.
Unfortunately, I kind of have this discussion with people I work with, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm still lending. I'm still thinking it's a good thing. But when we do our deeds of trust, we only do it to the value of our loan.
Mm-hmm.
Other banks sometimes will go, more than that, just to, I guess, cover themselves for any legal fees, I'm guessing, if needed. But so sometimes they don't have to refinance when going into a new construction loan. However, basically we would have to do new closing because our deeds of trust are only at the level of whatever our loans are.
Got it.
So you still do pay new closing costs and things like that.
Okay.
Robert, I have a question about that. All right, so if they have the land loan and they change it into a construction loan, do they have to worry about the down payment again? Do they have to make up a difference if there was one? I know there shouldn't be because the land loan was 80/20, but will they have to pay any more of a down deposit or a down payment, or are they just for deposit, or are they just going to be paying standard closing costs?
Yeah, it depends on. It's tough to say because there's so many scenarios. It's 95% loan to value financing. So if that 20% covers whatever 5% of the total cost once you include the house, then they're good. If it's if the house is super large and the land was kind of small, then you may still have a down payment. It's hard to say without looking at the numbers, because there are situations where they don't need anything and there are situations where they do need something. So basically, if you take whatever their down payment was and then you take whatever 5% of the total value of the construction and the land is if they're equal, then great. If the 5% is less than that 20%, then you don't need anything except for closing costs. But if that 20% is larger than that 5%, then you would have to make up whatever the difference is.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Chrissy, can you talk a little bit about perk tests for those of us that have not done a land deal ever?
Yeah, sure. What would you like to know about a perk test, Christy?
Honestly, just the rundown. Like I know the bare minimum, but honestly, I don't know that much about it.
Okay, actually, I've got a couple of specific questions. Well, specific general questions, I guess, about the perk testing. How long do you expect it to take? What exactly is it looking for?
Okay, so what exactly is it looking for and how long does it take to get a perk test back? Okay,
Yeah.
so it's going to depend on the particular provider's ability to perk test. I had one take a week. I had one take 6 weeks. So it's just in when they can get there and when they can get those soil samples back. So because they are taking soil samples. So a perk test is actually a percolation test, and it is a test to determine water absorption rate in the soil. So it's, if that makes sense. So, and now what was the second question, Jed?
What basic, well, both of them, and what exactly they were testing for.
Okay. So like,
how about how much can a buyer expect to pay, and does the buyer or the seller pay that?
so typically the buyer is going to pay it. The seller may have already paid for one. However, that lot is going to be worth more because it is considered ready to build versus raw land. There's a couple of different tests they do. So the perk test, they have to do a minimum of 3 holes, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, right? And they are digging down a depth to 3 to 6 feet, depending on the area. So our area in particular, they have a tendency of not going down quite that far because you hit groundwater. So we have much wider drain fields than they have where somewhere has sandy soil and a much, groundwater much lower, because they don't need as much space. We need space for it to dissipate. Whereas, somewhere in the Midwest near the desert, you don't need all that. So it's just going to depend on the type. It's just going to depend on the type of septic that you have to have because that is the entire job of the gentleman that's doing the perk test. Now, you can get just a percolation test and only get part of that test, and you're only paying for that person to go out there and those laboratory fees, and it comes out to be a little less. Typically, it's around $800. Now, my people paid $1,200, and the reason they paid $1,200 is convenience. He did the perk test, the septic design, which means he designed the septic for their uses for that lot and filed it with the city for the permit. So it's kind of one of those things that, like, do you want to know it all? Do you not want to know it all? Because it depends on the land. So like that one was a waterfront piece of property, right? So we wanted to know what the septic design was, because the septic design was gonna dictate where they could place the house on the lot. Now, if you have, 10 plus acres, it's not gonna matter as much because you've got plenty of room. But on the 2 acres, there wasn't, and part of it's in the water, there wasn't enough room for everything to fit, which is why they ended up purchasing the variance. Because once we got everything layered up, the septic design dictated that the house had to be built into the landward setback of the wetlands. So they paid more to find out more based on that specific lot. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You okay?
I would say, if I could just add my 2 cents, the
Mhm.
different types of the way a property might perk are really important. And I think it's good for your clients to kind of understand. If it perks conventional, that's great. That's, I guess, probably 8,000-10,000 for a drain field, if I'm remembering right. However, if it's an advanced system, it can cost your clients up to $45,000 to put that septic in, and it requires more maintenance throughout the life of their septic system. So that's just another thing I like to bring up with potential buyers.
Yes. So yeah, because we did this last year. We have a whole video on our YouTube channel about different kinds of septic systems. And here, and we're starting to see this come up more often, but here we are starting to see some of the older tank septics that were approved by the health department when the house was built, in the 1950s. And those tanks now have to be replaced, and they cannot be replaced with a traditional system. They're having to be replaced with an alternate system. And an alternate system is an above ground system, which is extraordinarily expensive. So again, like I was talking with, checking to see if there are wells, like irrigation wells that were built too close to the property line, right? If you have one of those built too close to the property line, you're not going to have be able to have a drain field near that well, which means you're going to have to build an alternate system, which, I mean, he's right. Yeah, it costs about $45,000 for an alternate system.
Your buyer has to be ready for all that.
That's why it's better to spend, like, if they really want to buy a lot and build their own house, and it's, and it's not a huge lot, it is always best to spend the money to do. I'd rather spend $4,000 than spend $45,000. That's also why I built it into my contract that the seller was agreeing to purchase back at least the wetlands delineation from my buyer. At least I could get them half of, that was the most expensive thing, so that I could get them at least half of their dollar back. That's not going to work in all situations, but this is why I like to do as much due diligence up front as I can, because if you call the city and you call land records, sometimes they'll have old wetlands delineations that were filed. Those ladies in land record, they remember everything. I'm telling you, you can find out so much stuff. I called about one and they were like, oh yeah, there was an illegal build on that back in 1982. I was like, okay. They remember everything. Be friends with the city. They're a pain in the butt to work with sometimes, but there are some really great people there that will point you in the right direction. So
I've had to call somebody And probably works. And if you're extremely nice to them, I think these people get a lot of phone calls. So if you're really nice to them, they will sometimes go above and beyond for you to like give you information.
100%.
I have another question.
You get one more.
We were talking about septics and all of that. What about finding out, is it just a call to the city to find out if you can tie into local utilities?
So, okay, so yes, you do have to call the city. And you also have to call the power company. So, depending on, actually, the power, Dominion Power is actually really cool because they have a whole thing that your contractor, whoever you're having build this house, can actually call in and request the review for the permit, and they will tell them how much it would cost to hook to that power or to bring the power down there at no cost. Dominion does that for free. If you do file the permit, I think it's a $250. It used to be $250. It's been a while. It might be 500 now. We don't know. But typically, if you're building, always, if you're hooking up to city water, city sewage, it's going to cost $10,000. $10,000 to hook up to city utilities.
This is crazy.
Because if you're prepared for that and it only ends up costing you $7,000, guess what? Guess who's happy? I say
So if
three.
you say 10,000, are you saying to one single family, or are you talking?
I'm talking about one single family home.
One single family, not a subdivision, like
Nope.
literally just the one. Okay. Cool.
So no, so just the one. Now, when you're doing a subdivision, okay, which is a little advanced for this, but if you're doing a subdivision, typically what's going to happen is inside of that land development, there is going to be a main hookup to everything. Depending on how many houses you are building is going to dictate how many hookups to the city mains that you have to
Potential
have.
pump station.
Right, and do you have to have a pump station to help pump it out? Do you have, and then that developer actually lays all of that themselves and then hooks up to the city main. So they might only hook up one time to the city main. It might only cost them, $10,000 for 40 houses, but they also build a $20,000 pump station.
And they had to put all the infrastructure in.
And they had to put all the infrastructure in. Yep,
Potentially curb and gutter,
yep, they have to do curb and gutter,
unless the swales are allowed.
right? Unless swales are allowed, but that's unusual around here, because that's why Amy Connolly is coming in next week, because the federal mandate, and this affects land too, the federal mandate for Chesapeake Bay Bay restrictions has updated, and she's going to clarify it for us. But the way that it initially reads makes it look like a lot of those big drainage ditches that are not the canals that run through farmland are now protected because of runoff. So, but she's gonna be here next month, so I'm excited about that because we need to know. But she's gonna go over all that with us, and then again, it just depends on what you're hooking up to the city, what you're not hooking up to the city. Everybody's really into these, like, we have buyers that want to build net zero homes, right? Oh, I want solar panels on it and a generator, and I don't want to hook up to any utility. You can't do that. Now, you might be able to do it in some of the more rural areas, but here inside of the city limits and things like that, because it's not hooked up to the power source. And again, you don't have to use it. It has to be hooked up though, because if it is not hooked up, it's considered condemnable, even if it's brand new. You remember the fight in Chesapeake back in the day when they were trying to make everybody switch from well water to city water?
Million variables.
So many.
Especially, like,
You just have to ask a lot of questions and hope that the listing agent on the other side is well versed in land. Cause that's your best resource, to be honest with you. I still call Herb out in Pungo when I have land questions. Yep. So I still call him because he's like the master of land. Like, that's all he's done for his entire career is sell all of Pungo. So, all right, guys, any more questions?
No, thank you both. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Chrissy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate you coming and talking us through it because I know that you guys do, some different stuff that most lenders don't do. I believe Robert also specializes in that, the USDA loans, don't you?
I do, yes.
Okay.
As far as USDA for housing, those are really, really tricky. I always tell people, if they're looking at that, to both not only contact me as a lender, but also contact USDA as well, because they have as much say as I do, basically.
Interesting. All right, guys. I appreciate everybody coming in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks for setting that up, Chrissy.